Are you willing to get involved militarily to defend Taiwan if it comes to that?
Yes.
Over the last few years, there has been growing tension in Taiwan, the US and the West, and many analysts are predicting that China is preparing to invade Taiwan. And Nancy Pelosi's recent trip to the country has done little to de-escalate tensions.
A resounding show of American support for Taiwan in the face of escalating threats from China.
China and Taiwan have been separated since the Chinese Civil War ended in 1949. The communists and nationalists in China had initially formed an alliance to defeat the Japanese as part of the Second United Front during the Second World War, but very shortly after victory they turned on each other and a bitter rivalry ensued. The subsequent communist victory in China ultimately led the nationalists retreating to Taiwan. The Chinese Nationalist Party, its officers and 2 million troops took part in the retreat, in addition to many civilians and refugees. Despite China failing to acknowledge Taiwan as an independent country ever since, the two countries have avoided outright war. This is largely because China's policy towards Taiwan has always been about peaceful reunification. China has largely believed that if it enhanced its economic, cultural and social ties with Taiwan, the Taiwanese people would see the light and reunification would be inevitable. This hasn't happened and China is becoming increasingly frustrated. So much so that on the Communist Party's 100-year anniversary on the 1st of July 2021, Chinese President Xi Jinping pledged complete reunification with Taiwan.
We start in China, where President Xi Jinping has said reunification with Taiwan must be fulfilled.
统一
Unification is the hope of all Chinese people. If China can be unified, all Chinese will enjoy a happy life.
便享福
If China can't unify, everyone will suffer.
Now, it's important to state that China has always maintained that reunification would be through peaceful methods, but it has never ruled out the use of military force if it doesn't get what it wants. War is obviously impossible to predict, and a Chinese invasion of Taiwan may or may not be imminent. The only people who know this are Xi Jinping and those around him. What therefore follows is my attempt to break down and explore the reasons that would lead China into invading Taiwan and what would be the implications of this globally. Because one thing is for sure, for the first time in decades, we must take China seriously that it could use military force to destabilise not only the region, but also the current world order. Now, the first thing that we need to do when breaking down everything and taking a balanced viewpoint is to consider the knowns and potential unknowns that will influence China's decision making on potentially using military force. We need to consider all perspectives, including China's, Taiwan's, and also the West's. And in this video, I will discuss 5 of the key areas that Xi Jinping is likely to be weighing up right now. And stay around until the end, because once we have covered these 5 key areas, I will give you the number 1 reason why I believe that China may ultimately invade Taiwan. So let's get into these 5 key areas. Firstly, while China has stated its aims of reunification, it has for 7 decades largely stuck to its strategic peaceful policies. Therefore, many believe fears over an imminent Chinese invasion are misplaced, and I tend to agree with this for reasons we will get into. I will caveat this though and say if the US and West continue to try and bully and dictate to China, then this may force China's hand and the invasion may happen very quickly. In defence of the West's scepticism of China's aims though, it is clear that China's stance and language used towards Taiwan have changed in recent years.
We do not promise to renounce the use of force and reserve the right to use all necessary measures.
We also have to remember that in 2005, China produced an anti-succession law, yes, an actual law, which says, Taiwan is part of China. The state shall never allow the Taiwan independent secessionist forces to make Taiwan secede from China under any name or by any means. Solving the Taiwan question and achieving national reunification is China's internal affair, which subjects to no interference by any outside forces. Finally, it states that if Taiwan continues to seek independence, then China reserves the right to employ non-peaceful means and other necessary measures to protect China's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Next up, we have the elephant in the room, which is Ukraine, and many commentators believe that Putin's invasion and the subsequent backlash from the West will force China into playing a longer-term game with Taiwan. The war in Ukraine should be a stark reminder to China that war is unpredictable, and invading and trying to occupy a population that doesn't want you there could be very costly, both in terms of loss of life and also economically. Given China's current fragile economy and the fact that they would likely suffer greater economic and international isolation sanctions compared to Russia, then this may give China a moment of pause. And we will get into all of this in much more detail shortly. On the flip side of this, support for forced armed reunification is high among the Chinese military and Chinese public. There is no longer such fear for China of the West following years of economic development and military investments. There are also many in the Chinese government who are of the opinion that America no longer has the military power to prevent a Taiwan invasion. China, in part, would also bank on the fact that it doesn't believe that America could drum up support for an international coalition against China, as many fear this would trigger a new global war. The third area that we need to consider is the military capabilities of China, Taiwan, and a US-backed intervention coalition to support Taiwan. Now, I don't think it will be a surprise to anyone when I say that China's military forces dwarf Taiwan's. China spends more on its military forces than any other country apart from the US. If we compare ground forces, Navy, Air Force and Reserves, tanks, aircraft, submarines, naval ships and artillery, then on paper this should be a very one-sided fight, but of course Ukraine has shown us that military might isn't everything. If a conflict were to erupt, then many commentators and experts suggest that the best option for Taiwan would be to slow down the Chinese invasion as best as it possibly can, whilst waiting for external help. That's indeed if external help would be offered and forthcoming, and we will get to this very shortly. Now, if we assume that support was given to Taiwan, the most obvious candidate is the US, but it's not clear if the US would be supported by other countries if it got involved in a direct conflict with China, as many other countries have been very ambiguous about their support for Taiwan. Until very recently, the US had also been very ambiguous when it was asked whether it would directly support Taiwan in conflict, but comments from Joe Biden and from Nancy Pelosi appear to show that the US's stance has moved. The White House, however, has always reiterated that the US would not intervene militarily. Now, the US would certainly even up a conflict between China and Taiwan if we compare ground forces, Navy, Air Force, Reserves, tanks, aircraft, submarines, naval ships and artillery, but there is international consensus that no country would have the appetite to get bogged down in a conflict of this scale, as the implications globally would be catastrophic. The fourth area that we need to consider is why Taiwan is so important to China and the rest of the world. And the answer is probably twofold here. Firstly, Taiwan's economy is hugely important on the global stage. 65% of all computer chips used in everyday electrical equipment, such as computers, laptops and phones, originate from Taiwan. Just 35% of computer chips manufactured worldwide come from outside of Taiwan, with South Korea and China being the notable manufacturers. For China, monopolising this market would be another great incentive when considering its Taiwan conundrum. This would be the first incentive for China. The second would be the strategic importance of Taiwan. Having control of the island of Taiwan would be a huge strategic asset for China in terms of its projection of power in both Southeast and Northeast Asia. If we boil it all down to the basics, over 30% of the world's trade passes through the South China Sea, and this is a big deal to both America and China in terms of achieving their longer-term aspirations. The US knows that if Taiwan becomes part of China, then neighbouring countries may be intimidated to become more pro-China, and this is something the US is keen to avoid. China would argue that its paranoia over the US is justified, considering how many different conflicts the US has instigated and driven, even within the short-term history books. And the number of US air bases and military ports in China's region has done nothing to reduce its paranoia. The problem is that we have two paranoid giants who are at odds. The US makes no apologies over its outspoken fear of China, and this simply pushes China into a constant hysterical posture of defiance and defence towards the US. It's a self-perpetuating problem that neither side will back down on. The fifth area that may determine whether China invades Taiwan will be how the political landscapes plays out in the US and China over the coming weeks and months. There are many issues in the US currently surrounding healthcare, immigration, religious freedoms, education, abortion laws, environmental issues, America's economic spending, the American welfare system, and an overall distrust in the ruling elite. And if many of these different problems continue through 2022 and beyond, and Joe Biden doesn't get a grip, and the US finds itself in more of a chaotic situation due to the predicted economic downturns, then China might just be tempted to take their chances against Taiwan while the US is distracted domestically. Equally, China has battled its own internal political and economic problems over the last few years, and it has been tied to boosting growth through debt-financed infrastructure and real estate investment. Such growth models are obviously unsustainable long-term. If this were to lead to a major economic crisis within China, which caused a crisis of political legitimacy of President Xi, then he may choose to use an invasion of Taiwan as a political distraction. Look over there to forget what is happening here. So where does all of this leave us, and what is likely to be the main reason that China invades Taiwan? Well, the first thing to say is that China has already committed to reunification, either peacefully or via military means. Taiwan has recently repeatedly stated that it will not back down, so therefore it's logical to state that at some point in time, China will invade Taiwan. The question then becomes when. On the balance of probabilities, communications coming out of Beijing, and what many analysts are stating, an invasion is certainly on the cards, but it is likely that China will play the waiting game with Taiwan. President Xi has been watching the progress of Russia in Ukraine and has likely been shocked about the international backlash and sanctions that Russia has been hit with. Xi will be fully aware that a failed or complicated invasion could pose a major threat to the Chinese Communist Party's regime. Anything but a swift, decisive victory will see Chinese citizens question Xi's legitimacy and competency. The other thing at the back of Xi's mind will be economic growth and stability, which are foundational to the Chinese Communist Party's rule in China. Even if China's invasion succeeds, Xi knows that he will need to start a large-scale conflict at the centre of one of the most lucrative shipping supply chains in the world. So Xi may very well achieve his longer-term aspirations of taking control of Taiwan, only to undermine and destroy his country's economic growth and stability pillars that are fundamental to his legitimacy as a leader. And then we get to the question of whether the US and others would intervene if China invaded. And the likely reality is that despite what Biden and Pelosi have recently stated about commitments to Taiwan, Taiwan would simply become another Ukraine. The US would likely backtrack on comments made, it would not directly intervene, but merely supply additional weaponry to help Taiwan defend itself. Now this video is titled "The Real Reason That China Will Invade Taiwan," and I have shown in this video it's a complicated landscape, but if I had to boil it all down to a single reason, then this would be it. As Paul Valery famously once said, war is a massacre of people who don't know each other for the profit of people who know each other but don't massacre each other. This is unfortunately the world we live in, and it could be today or in 3 years, but eventually another massacre will take place.